Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Anchor Community Spotlight. I've got a guest who I will introduce in just a moment, and he's a very good friend of mine. I've known him for a very long time, and he's a very passionate individual who likes to talk about the things he's passionate about. So I'm looking forward to minimizing the amount I talk and maximizing the amount of exposure we can give to his wonderful projects. So if you would like to see more of these, then you can subscribe to the Anchor YouTube channel. We also have a discourse, and all our open source tools are all on GitHub. They're all in the Anchor organization. You may recognize the two little friends on screen, Syft and Grype, our SBOM scanner, and Grype, our vulnerability detector. But we're not here to talk about those. We're here to talk with Jorge Castro, who is open source community engineer and developer relations. Those are like what everyone probably knows you for at CNCF Linux Foundation, but we're mostly here to talk about Universal Blue. Hello, George. How are you?
It is great to see you.
It's lovely to see you too. I mean, we only recently saw each other at KubeCon in London,
Yeah, it
which was
was
lovely.
it was really good to kind of rehearse what we were going to talking about because I think we went over this multiple times.
Yes, we did. Wonderful. Right. So I just have to give one little brief slide, which is for those people who have never heard of Anchor. We're a little company, but we've been around a little while, and I've mentioned some of the tools that we've got published on the internet. Syft, Grype, and Grant. Grant is the newest of all of them and doesn't have a mascot yet. So if you know anyone who can do good artwork, I'd love to get a mascot for Grant. And those are all free software, Apache license tools you can find on GitHub. But you can also give us money, and we have an enterprise tool that is very useful if you are an enterprise that has a large number of SBOMs, and there are some logos on the screen that give you an indication of the sizes of organizations that use our enterprise tools. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk to George, and I wanted to start with a real simple question for you, George. Why are there so many names for all these projects you have? You have Universal Blue, Bazzite,
Man,
Keynight. There's so many of them. Like, if you could boil it down, what is all this stuff?
best intentions, Alan. Best intentions. It started off relatively simple. Um, I was migrating away from Ubuntu at the time. I'd discovered other Linuxes, and you and I worked at Canonical for a long time. And um, what I really wanted to make was Bluefin, which is the dinosaur one. Um,
The dinosaur one, Bluefin, this
the
one.
dinosaur one, which is my, like uh Marco Wayne and I had worked on this like as a prototype, and it was like our Ubuntu killer, right? The thing I wanted to do. If I had, Red Hat was working on this tool that allowed me to, make my own experience, and I wanted to go in a direction is like, what if Ubuntu had gone in the way I wanted? So it was a very selfish thing at first. Um,
And for those people who may not be aware, these names have significance. Like the Universal Blue or Ublue is derived from Silverblue, and it's a
yeah, so they
smashing together of Ubuntu and Silverblue kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think at the time we were looking at the domain and we got ublue.it, like you blew it. So the idea was like point at a laptop and say, you blew it, like would be the commercial or something.
Right. And Bluefin, yeah, this is a real inside baseball, but the
It is
head
definitely.
office of Canonical
Yeah.
sponsors of Ubuntu, it's the Bluefin building, or at least it was, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Um,
cool.
so I wanted to make that, but then in order to do that, you have to have base images and build a community and things like that. So I actually had to decompose it into base images first of all, and that's what became Universal Blue. So instead of one thing that's just Bluefin, we made base images that were kind of like our soup stock, and uh, we use Bootc. So this is a container pattern, right? Which is
Right.
we needed base images, but then you have the final product image. I had wanted to build the product, but I had to go backwards. So the first prototype was kind of janky, and then after that, as people started to join and they like knew what they were actually doing, because the first cut was literally my fix it script shoved into a Docker file.
So I think that's somewhere that like people may like. It's nice to hear the origin story,
Yeah.
but and like what motivated you to do this?
Yeah.
Like, why was no one else doing this? Why are all
I don't
Linux
know.
distros just wrong? Right? Why are you right?
Well, at the time, I had read the spec and I knew what they were going to do. And this was all for server side stuff, right? You have CoreOS and you want to make an appliance and you want to put the Stig stuff on there first or whatever, or all that stuff. So the pattern is just like a Docker file from base image and then DNF install your packages. And then anything that works in a container file, you can do in there. So the first thing I did was copy the wallpaper from the GitHub repo. It's literally a copy statement like any other container into the wallpaper directory. And then you type podman build or Docker build, and an operating system container comes out. And it's just like any other Docker file, except there's a kernel in there, and you can boot on it on a piece of bare metal.
So you started developing this on
Oh,
your
you cut out.
workstation, right? Sorry?
Oh, you cut out for a second there.
Oh, sorry. So you started developing this on your workstation, just using the standard tools everyone uses,
Yeah.
like Docker and Podman, building a container image. How does that like? We'll talk more about the automation and the
Sure.
cloud side of things, but how do you get from that to it now being the primary operating system on a machine? It feels like
Yeah.
there's a lot of machinery between those two places.
Yeah. So you need a base image, and that's Fedora, which already makes a desktop. So I didn't have to start from scratch. There are
Right.
times where you want to start from scratch, but we very much, I'm always a believer of get the loop working first, then whittle things down. Because once you get fast, you can do anything. So I, the first one was literally just Fedora with a different wallpaper.
Aren't all distros, Linux distros, that to start with?
It's all the same thing, and that's one of the reasons we also say we're not a distro. So I had
Right.
you and I had done desktop at Canonical,
Mhm.
and I had done server, but then I went cloud native. Then I kind of came back to the Linux desktop, and I was like, hey, wait a minute, things are still the same way they were 10 years ago. Whereas on the server side, cloud transformed everything, and everything was different, even though the tenets were the same, right? Like reliability is still the same. We're still
Right. So
using Linux, but
when you
it's
say
different.
things are still the same,
Yeah.
like you mean like people are installing a distro and then using apt or yum to install their packages or going and finding software on the internet and installing that on their machine, and
Yeah.
it's not orchestrated. Is that what you're getting at, right?
Right. Because at work, at cloud, we have sysadmins who run this stuff for you, right? And you have a platform team that designed the thing and their specs, and that's all professionalized, right? In desktop Linux, it's literally here's your product, good luck, right?
Right.
And then we call community back in those days. Oh, George and Alan are really nice on the forums, and they'll help you fix your computer, right? And we called community that after support thing, right? And so,
Right.
still in desktop, when people talk about communities, they're talking about, you know, I remember Michael Hall would sit there and like respond to people on Reddit, and there's always going to be that. But the difference, I think, now is by bringing that cloud native pattern to the desktop, we deploy Bluefin as like a deployment that our users are using. And then the community aspect is kind of built into the operations of using the desktop, right? So the difference here being is instead of there being the developers that work on the distribution and then you have the end users and you're trying to connect them, we kind of act as, we call it the desktop DevOps pattern, where our job is to kind of help manage and run the deployment of Bluefin, because once you install it, you're getting your updates and things like that, and we treat it almost like a live Kubernetes deployment, right? Like this
Right.
month, it's like, okay, it's time to upgrade our users from Fedora 41 to Fedora 42. We're doing that for you in the background in GitHub, and you're getting the end product as opposed to, all right, 10,000 of you all upgrade at once. Good luck. You know, if you have a problem, let me
Right.
know.
And I think we've both had experience of, you mentioned the community aspect being giving people technical support. We've both had experience of, people's machines breaking when they
Right.
upgrade from one release to another, and that's like a 6 monthly problem in
Yeah.
in the Ubuntu land, where or any distro that puts out a release every 6 months.
Hmm.
And you're doing something different. And there's two things I want to touch on here. One is the immutability, the read-onliness,
Hmm.
and also the ability to move backwards and forwards and sideways with these containers. Can we talk about those two?
Absolutely. So these are cloud native patterns, right? Um, so the container image is read only, because of course it is. Um, Unlike traditional Linux distributions, a slash user is read only. So there usually isn't any mangling of packages or things like that, which causes gnashing of teeth there. But the idea there being that the operating system is an artifact that ships to you. Your customizations is your config, and that lives on a separate layer, just like how we do in cloud. So when you do a Docker run, you know how you mount, there's a directory on the left and a directory on the right. One of it is the stuff on the inside, and one of the stuff is your stuff on the outside. And then you configure your system that way, but you leave the core operating system clean and image based. So that gets updates independently of your config, and then ultimately your data, which is what we really care about. And I put your applications also in this data, because unlike the traditional model, the applications and the core operating system are split on purpose, just like how in cloud, a Kubernetes cluster and those containers that run on that cluster are totally separate and unrelated. The version of PHP in that container has nothing to do with anything on the host operating system.
Right.
So that is a split from the app get install PHP days. Um,
So that I have to touch on, I can almost hear people shouting at their screens. Yeah, but I like having control over the
yeah,
file system, and I like being able to edit files in the etc directory, and I
yeah,
want to be a sysadmin as part of my job at home. Like
yeah,
that, that's something, some feedback you've had over the years on the subject of this immutability, this read-only bit.
yeah.
And is it difficult getting that message across that actually it's not a big blocker, right?
Yeah, I think so. There's two people. If with Bluefin specifically, there's two audiences. First, it's going to be like our moms and dads who are like have an old computer and we set it up for them and we never want to hear from them again. So I think we got that covered. It's
Right.
like they need a web browser. And then the other half is kind of people like us who are already kind of used to the pattern. The people in the middle who are maybe traditional Linux desktops are kind of stuck in this. Well, I kind of know enough to get dangerous, But I think it also I think one of the things that I've realized the most, especially being so involved with like Ask Ubuntu and documentation and things in the past, is old habits die hard, right? So Etsy's totally writable, right? So you could totally do all that stuff.
Oh, okay.
Usually config is very writable. What I think a lot of people don't understand is how the tools actually work. So you might get used to, if I tell you edit the Apache service on an Ubuntu machine, right? You might be used to, SUing into root and then editing user share systemd, blah blah blah, and then you go on a Bluefin system, you try to save it, and it says no, and you're like, I hate it. There's no freedom here, right?
Right.
Right. When the actual command is system cuttle edit Apache, you hit enter, and the system will automatically take that read only thing, put it in the right mutable part of the disk, right? Then you make your local edits and then you save it automatically, and then it bounces the service. So now your system has
Right.
the file that came with the operating system untouched. How many of you have ever messed up a file because I was reading something or whatever? So you have that, right? But the system is also designed to come that way. And I think a lot of Linux users don't um, take the time to look at that stuff, because I
Right.
love,
Well,
even on Ubuntu machines, I do it this way because
right. But
it's just the
that's,
right
I
way.
mean, I've heard you say this I don't think I'm breaking any confidences here by saying I've heard you say like this isn't for 1990s Linux guy.
Yeah.
It's not for that person who is very entrenched in, I will do things this way and I will not do anything
Yeah.
else. Give me an init system that isn't system D. Give
Right.
me X. Don't give me Wayland. All that kind of stuff. You've got to be a little bit flexible with this, but not to the point where everything is read-only and you can't touch anything, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And also I found too, when you actually read up on the documentation, I've been using this stuff for years. So the fact to go back and reread, no, I already know this tool backwards and forwards. So you have to kind of decouple that first, and then you go in and be like, wow, if I look at all the tools provided, there is a correct way to use Linux. And that kind of flies in the face of how we grew up. Where it was like, no, you're going to do your own,
How dare you,
your own
George? How dare
thing, and
you?
you have the
Right.
freedom to brick it. And if you brick it, you should have that right, but
Yes.
also I have a job, and I prefer to drive my vehicle correctly as
So
the
you said
manufacturer intended,
one of those classes of people is like the mum and dad, that kind of person. But you've attracted a kind of different community of people who are. You mentioned
Yeah.
it earlier, like people who are contributing to the build process, the DevOps
Yeah.
side of stuff, right? And you also appear to have attracted users who are outside the common, what you
Yeah.
might think of a traditional Linux community. How did that happen? And was that part of the plan,
It was
or is
there
that
was no plan here,
happenstance?
Alan. It was, if all I needed was a desktop, and once we got the
Right.
loop going, it was like we can run this in perpetuity. I need one person in every time zone to keep track of a kernel regression so we can pin it, just in case. So the actual running of the project itself is relatively straightforward, and we can really punch above our weight. However, the pattern and that final container feels a lot like a finished product if someone knows what they're doing. And Kyle came along and wanted to do this thing called Bazzite, which is a gaming spin of things. So Bluefin is kind of my Ubuntu for me. And then Bazzite is the one that really came along because what this did is they took all of the patches that Valve had been posting for the Steam Deck and wrapped all those up and did all the distro. There's RPMs. There's RPMs in there, Alan. There's a lot of RPMs.
It's fine. It's fine. It's fine.
But the users
I'll
don't have
cope.
to care because they just get a final finished product, right? And our intent
Right.
is go play Halo. Don't top 10 things to do to your operating system after you install it. Like, so this pattern, because it literally is, you can do what you want in a Docker file, is a bunch of gamer nerds focusing on that experience. So they really focus on getting things set up out of the box. They choose the right tools for you. And you basically say, I want to be a gamer and I want to learn all this stuff, but I want to start where Kyle is because he's the expert. He had a year of helping people with like SteamOS on the Discord and stuff like that. So it was very straightforward. This one in particular here, because you have the operating system image on the laptop and the Steam Deck. It's just a Docker file, so it's literally the same OS. So you can game on your. So I have a home theater PC with Bazzite, I have my gaming rig with Bazzite, and I have a handheld with Bazzite. And with cloud syncing, I have the same experience. And then on my laptop, it's the same kind of convergence. How many billions of dollars have Xbox and PlayStation spent on this kind of convergent thing? And they all have my Plex client, and they all have my music, and they connect to my Jellyfin server, and
Right.
my Spotify app is on all of them, and that kind of stuff. And it just kind of gives me that experience, except we control it as a community. So this leads to the software kind of and the operating system itself being very conducive to the people that are using it. So they kind of get exactly what they want out
And
of
and
it.
this Bazzite is like, I mean, you've talked about it being like aimed for something like a Steam Deck or a laptop where you want
Yeah.
to play games. Like there's a focused task, right? And that task
Yes.
is open Steam,
Exactly.
shoot some things, right? Or
Right.
dance or whatever it is you're playing.
Yeah.
But you've got these others like Bluefin, which is more like a developer workstation, and
Yeah.
then there are other spins as well. But the root is all the same, right? They
It's
come
all those
from the
base
same
images.
path,
Right.
right?
So when Kyle enables I think someone just enabled the fan controller for framework laptops. We do that in a repository, and then all the images build. So Aurora, Bluefin, and Bazzite all get that. So it very much is the container pattern where it's like, okay, everyone agrees to maintain these base images. And then it also allows people who aren't Universal Blue to consume our base images and make their own. So there's one called Blues 95, which actually, open this. You have to see this. This is too cool.
What? Where am I?
Blues 95, just put that in Google somewhere.
Oh, gosh.
BLUES, like Blues 95. That's it.
That one, Blues.win.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, there you go. So one of our contributors took XFCE and they skinned it to look like Windows, and it's a full Windows 95 experience. Yeah, scroll down, check out the pages. So it just lets people kind of do what they want, and they started with a base image, which is nice because those generate every day. We grab the security updates, right? We have our Syft action running, doing its business. But people can explore. I mean, he even made the email client. Look at that. So you can do that, even though like I decided to just kind of put dinosaurs in Linux. The flexibility here is very apparent once you get past the base images. So
it also feels like
a cloud person will look at these and totally understand the architecture. They're going to be like, wow, it looks like my Docker file at work.
It's also like, it sounds like it's easy for someone, well, maybe more straightforward for someone to create a spin, whereas to create an official like spin of some other distros, you've got to stand up whole repositories or
like paperwork.
Yes, and things to sign and so on. But you've got people going back to the community side of things who, if I scroll down here, this is a very, very long page.
I know.
There's some nice stats down here. Like obviously that you're highlighting and signposting where the community go, but you're also highlighting some metrics to like show, these people are getting something done. They're not just downloading a thing and playing games, right?
Yeah. So this is another cloud native tenant. If you look at open telemetry, is the second most popular thing that we have in the CNCF, right? And that's observability. Like when I did research before starting Bluefin, I talked to one of the Kubernetes co-maintainers, and he was like, he was asking me, he's like, are you measuring everything? I was like, not really. And he's like, you should, because if we would have measured things in Kubernetes way earlier, think of the millions of dollars we would have saved these organizations, like performance-wise, scalability. But in order to do that, you have to have like a policy, and smart people need to like write that down. There's privacy, there's air gap issues. Banks are going to have an opinion, all of this kind of stuff. So the nice thing about these images kind of being more consumer oriented is that, we really only need to count you. We don't need all the neat details or whatever, but Fedora does collect them, but they kind of bury it. And usually when analytics are brought up in open source, right, there's like gnashing of teeth, and
they use bad metrics, and you get bad data from. We're not even going to mention it. You get bad data, whereas what you're trying to do is gather enough data that you can make decisions, or like, this is like Bazzite, roughly, number of active users. This is some number to be proud of, right? 30,000 people are using this cloud deployed platform. I'm trying not to say distro, George. It's very hard.
Well, the reason we don't say distro is like, remember, we're going back to the desktop people, and they kind of have distros, whereas in cloud, how many MySQL containers can you name off the top of your head? Like there's so many. There's like Percona, MySQL, Maria, and then Ubuntu makes one. Every distro makes one. Everyone will sell you a MySQL container, right? But no one gets wrapped up around the axle around, there's too many MySQL containers, right? Like the only people that need to care are the platform teams that have to consume those containers. Like MySQL database people need to care, and they're going to have opinions. So I try to make it more of like, everyone's going to have one of these, and you're just going to find your community more than, it's more about the community is the primitive instead of the distro. And then you build a community around that, because we are actually trying to move away from identifying with a distribution as your thing, where it's more of the community. It's like, I want to play games, right? So I would ideally, in Bazzite, it's not just about Bazzite. There's communities around people around playing Titanfall, right? And that's what we
Right.
want, and not
So
the distro as much.
you've mentioned Bluefin a couple of times, and for it's like targeted for developers, or developers are one of the like
Yeah,
target audience for this. Now, obviously, you are someone who is like within the world of software development, like all day, every day, as part of the CNCF, and so you have an idea for what a developer wants on their workstation, but every single developer is different. Like
yeah,
I may want like some packages from Brew, and somebody
yeah.
else wants a bunch of Node stuff on their machine. It, is there any like blocker to them doing the stuff that they are familiar with using these tools?
Yeah, so this is what took the most amount of research, was the developer experience, because shipping a browser and an operating system that is automated was a relatively straightforward task.
Mhm.
But developers have different needs. That's why I'm very, very focused on cloud native developers for a few reasons. Is um,
Well, they're
First of all,
familiar with this process, right? They get
yeah,
it, right? Right.
yeah, and they're all on Macs, right? And this
Right.
kind of bothered me. But however, when you talk, there was this guy I used to work with, Andy Goldstein. He's on Mac, Linux expert, and I would be like, hey, can you explain this Kubernetes stuff for me? And he would open his terminal, and he would just Linux. Like, I would be blown away on how like he could like do all his setups. His aliases were like perfect. I had no idea what's going. Just seeing someone just go hard, you're just like, wow, dude, you're such an expert, but doesn't use a Linux desktop, you know, because I think for a
Right.
lot of these folks, like they tried it a long time ago. It'd be kind of does the sound still not work on those things? Can you guys copy and
Right.
paste? Like you're kind of the butt of the joke. However, what's very interesting is these folks know Linux to an extent that is absurd to me. Like they will tell you every little part of the inside of the kernel and all that stuff. They just don't consume Linux desktops. So I started to just pay attention what tools they were into. So that's kind of why, in the early days, we would argue in Ubuntu land all day. Did the dock go on the left or on the right? Are there indicators? Da, 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 da. I just say, nope, put it on the bottom. People can move it. We're going to move on to something else. And I kind of focus on what people don't have. And initially, at first, because this is a Fedora thing, getting Docker to work on Linux distros is just kind of really annoying. So nobody had a Docker first experience. So I shipped that alongside Podman, because Podman now it's in the CNCF, right? And that's the tool I want you to use. But it's also really useful when you could copy and paste any README in GitHub and have that come up, right? Because we were noticing you can't tell people take that Docker command, but then replace it with Podman, and then people get into trouble because they don't understand the differences. So, as a
But you,
community, we're able to say ship them both, whereas no distribution would do
right.
would
Yeah,
do
you
that.
as a distribution vendor, you generally pick one of everything, right?
Right.
As the in the
Exactly.
defaults. But you also, sorry, I forgot where I was going to go with that. Uh,
That's where
you
Homebrew came
also
from, if that
like
was your question.
I found I dug in there and I found it.
Yeah.
People are like deploying stuff on one particular distro, like Debian or
Yeah.
Ubuntu in their cloud or in their infrastructure, and so they're familiar with like apt and stuff like that. And so, is it quite a jump, or is there an easy way for them to have their familiar tools as well as the like the Docker and the Podman? And what
Right.
about the normal tools that like Linuxy nerds
Yeah.
are familiar with, right?
Yeah. So the big one that we added was Homebrew. This was I feel it's our killer feature, even though
Right.
it does lead to some people really don't like Homebrew, right? Oh, it's Ruby, right? It does that weird /home Linux brew thing. It's not exactly, copacetic in that point, but I take the view that I want the ecosystem. And it's very easy as a Linux nerd to be like, yes, you're right. It does not do these things correctly, and get spun around the axle, when it's really like, if I know every Mac developer knows how to use Homebrew, I could give them a place at home. Typically my users have Macs. I don't convince them to switch, right? But if you have a spare laptop or a VM, if you have that same tooling, you can bring your brew file with you, and it kind of feels very much like a Mac, I can't believe I have to say that. In the past, you know how like yeah, I used to be so Linux about it. Um, but there's a lot of value for users who want to use Homebrew because for development, they are using Ubuntu, right? And they just type Docker Compose up, and then their Ubuntu containers come up. Um, However, like Brew is a rolling release, right? So like I know some people use it for development, but I feel that makes it inappropriate for development because when you're at work, I need Ubuntu 2204, and that's what it says on the tin. So by providing Podman and convenience tools like Distrobox lets people play as if they're on an Ubuntu machine.
So Distrobox is the thing that lets you have a terminal like I would on an Ubuntu system like Control Alt T
yeah,
and there's a terminal and it's my host OS and I'm in there doing apt or whatever it is I'm doing. And
right.
with Distrobox you get a window, but it might not be Ubuntu. It might be Ubuntu, but it might not be. But it's not the host OS, right?
Yeah, it could be whatever you want. So we used to ship this by default. I don't do it anymore because I got people in trouble. But when you hit Control Alt U, it would just launch an Ubuntu terminal.
Nice.
So if you're sitting on a plane, it looks like I'm using Ubuntu. I'm in there. I'm using apt if I want that kind of stuff. But I'm keeping it's decoupled from the OS. So at that point, it doesn't matter what the host or all that stuff is. So we have people who have build systems in Ubuntu and all that stuff. They're able to use these systems, without being the odd
It's
person
not
out.
alien to them,
Yeah,
right?
and one of the things I really harp on this is using things like dev containers where the development environment is declared inside that project in its Git repo, so you can Git pull it on any operating system and type podman build. That should work.
Right.
Whether so, one of the reasons I'm not just trying to make us distribution agnostic, I'm trying to make us operating system agnostic. You know what sucks using Linux? Being the one person on your team that uses Linux, right? And then like getting called
Right.
out every time your thing is slightly different, But if you're hanging out with your Mac folks and everything is declared in Git and the right version of Python or whatever gets pulled down, that's what you want. And then additionally, because I'm fortunate to work with so many talented developers, I know what all the cool stuff is. So Python people right now, UV is what they want. Like it's
Oh
totally
yeah.
awesome. Like, so we give them UV. I give you Brew, and because I give you Brew, you can install anything. So Pixie is another one that lets you. It brings in Conda packages from that ecosystem.
Oh
So
wow.
I kind of put a joke like this in the doc, hey, it was like this when I got here, right? There's like 37 package managers. And really at some point, you just gotta pick a set of them and be like, look, you're gonna figure it out. And I know the Python people will end up just using UV. They might not use Homebrew, The Mac transplants will use Homebrew. The traditionalists, I think, will grab an Ubuntu terminal or an Ubuntu container
And
or
then do
Bazzite.
Python
Arch
pip
Arch
or whatever.
Arch
Right.
distro boxes get you everything, right? Like so.
Right.
When it
So,
breaks,
so
just throw it
what
away.
you're getting to a point where you've got a set of applications that are being delivered in these containers, in these OCI images.
Right.
What, and it's no longer just you. Like there are a lot of distros that are like one man band or one person entity where the whole responsibility for that thing is with that one person, right?
Yeah.
And when a new vulnerability comes out to like try and crowbar a little bit of our stuff in,
Oh yeah.
when a
Let's talk about
vulnerability
it.
comes out, it's on them to solve that problem. Whereas how do you solve the problem when you've got people deployed with all these containers? You've got to identify the vulnerabilities and rebuild all the containers, and then that just deploys to everyone, and everyone just has to press an update button, and they're
Yeah.
done.
Yeah. So
Literally,
one of the very first tenets we did was automatic updates, right?
right?
Because like traditional Linux is like, I want control of my computer. And literally, like, would you ever give someone you care about a device that doesn't auto update? I would,
Mhm.
even though eventually it becomes a brick, right? But that's the world we live in. So it is all about automatic updates for us. The automation is where we actually invest. I would say that the artifacts aren't the primary product as much as the automation. So we build it fresh every day from Fedora or CentOS or whatever it is.
And these are
Um,
just GitHub actions that are
these are
running.
all GitHub actions. Yep. So
Right.
what happens is we have one repository where the drivers are A key mods. That's the root of the thing. And we have a renovate thing that watches the Fedora releases. When that releases, it kicks off a rebuild. And then all of the subsequent repositories dependent on that rebuild with a set of like cascading renovate actions. So when someone comes out and says, hey, there was a vulnerability in Fedora, everyone update, which hasn't happened in a while, when they do that, we just auto rebuild. And all of the user machines check in every day, even though by default we put you on a weekly image. But if there is a vulnerability, we can publish to that weekly tag. We publish to a weekly tag for efficiency reasons because the downloads aren't yet Z standard chunked and stuff, so they're still kind of hefty. Right. But yeah, and then everybody gets it. And along that time, one of the things we're investing in is let's talk about Syft, because I was growing frustrated and like, yeah, I have this long chain, right? And there's security of the actual payload itself, which is Fedora, right? And we outsource most of that, right? We trust that someone on the Fedora team, when they do a security bump of a thing, that they're doing it, right? And ultimately, you have to trust them. But then I was finding it difficult to figure out I got to follow the entire supply chain. And that's all we're talking about right now at work, right? Is like securing all this stuff together. So right. For us, getting those Syft actions in place was something that Robert and Tulip have been working on this cycle, because at first I went and I turned them on in GitHub and I was just burning carbon, and I didn't really know how to use them and stuff. And it's very easy to be cynical, right? It's like, well, I turned them on, I guess I'm good, right? Like, right. But
you got your SBOM, you're done now, right?
Right. But now there was a different, so I, for those of you in the audience, I called Alan. I was like, hey, look, man, I actually have to know this thing. I want to get it going, because also our images are much larger than like an Nginx image. So there's developer velocity things involved. So at first we were generating the SBOMs all the time, and that added an extra 10 minutes, which is awful, and then we decided, hey, what's better? When it's doing a pull request, don't generate the SBOMs, generate when you're doing the final push from the merge queue instead. And so those kind of operational things that you do. Right. And then you prototype that in one repo, and then it works, and then you copy that pattern everywhere else, and then you wait a week, and see what happens. So we're definitely generating now. What I don't have, and this is something I would love to see just like in the industry across the board, is like, I feel like the blog post should be like, you have an SBOM, now what?
Yeah.
Like, okay, so like it gives me the version of MySQL in here. Okay, so now how does this correlate to, I just read a CVE this morning. Is there a thing, like, what connects this to that? How do I know I'm safe? So and usually.
Yeah, one of the things I've recently done on some of my repositories is I've added an action that runs Syft, obviously generates an SBOM, but then I have another action that runs Grype, and it generates a Sarif report, which I can then upload back into GitHub. And then in the security tab for that project, it surfaces all those vulnerabilities every time. That's probably a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I totally want, because what I want, and I showed you in the metrics, right? When we talk about one-person projects and risk in open source, I think everyone's talking about right now, is I think the way we combat that is be upfront about your metrics, right? Like, I take a very F1 approach to this. Like, you can't win a race unless you instrument the car. So we should be upfront about where our contributors are, where the code is. And I know, like, sometimes you run the scanner and it's all red and that looks scary, and you kind of feel like all I'm going to do is scare a bunch of people. And then instead of saying, don't use this, it's a one-person project, they're going to say, look at all the red on the report, this is awful. Do I want that? Because they're all kind of red.
Right.
But like, at some point you just have to say,
Yeah. So just to, like, I happened to create this for another project yesterday, and it just creates a little Docker image, and actually it's not this one. So in this one, if we look at security advisories, that is it that one? Yeah, there's nothing in there, right?
Right.
But if I go back to there's another repository that I created yesterday. I should have had this open. Sorry.
It's all good.
I think that one. Yeah, so this one, if we go to the actions, it's the same kind of thing, but this one I've added something, and this builds the Docker image. If you look at the build, it generates an SBOM, then scans it for vulnerabilities, and then uploads that report into Docker. And there's an action for that as well. So that's pretty straightforward. But then what that means is up here, when I go to security, sorry, code scanning is where I wanted to go. In here, you can see the vulnerabilities in a friendly way. Like you could, if you wanted to, read the JSON that comes out of Grype, but ain't no one got time for that. You want
man, I
this
hate that
to
thing.
render it for you, right? So that's another thing that you might want to consider doing because that gives the visibility. It surfaces it up, and people don't have to go digging for it because it's like right here in the GitHub page that they're going to be going to all the time.
I didn't know I could do this right now. That is good to know.
We're all learning, right?
What else you got? You know what I love about your tools? Legit.
What?
Your command line experience. Your progress bars, like the way it feels modern, but not, it's tasteful. It's not,
You're
not
too
a
kind.
Nyan cat, you know?
So one of the questions, like screeching off on a tangent, Sam Weston asked, George, what's with all the dinosaurs, right?
Yeah. So this is interesting because the CNCF is an ecosystem of stuff, right? We have 220 projects and various, like, go to l.cncf.io for me.
Mhm.
Just l. Yeah, there you go. So we have all of these projects. And the day gig is pretty much, this is an ecosystem of stuff. And I think in the old days we talked about software, but in open source specifically, you have groups of developers around each of these projects, and some overlap and some are involved in multiple ones. Some are competitors, some are natural fits to each other. There's like an entire ecosystem of stuff. And I've been taking after my sabbatical, I've been taking a more anthropological approach to open source, which is, this is about distributed computing and distributed people, right? Like if I could distill it down to the two things. So I want to take a more naturalist view about it when it comes to things like project health, extinction. Sometimes organizations in this group make decisions about licenses or something, or, some get archived. They've fulfilled their purpose and they die out, right? So I've been I wanted Bluefin to say something, right? But I didn't really know what it was going to say. Like Ubuntu, like, you know what Ubuntu stands for because of the word, and I didn't have an equivalent of Ubuntu. So I wanted to highlight the kind of ecosystems around the software and the people, because this is intended to be an entry point for folks. I want to design, like, if your kid wants to do a project with a Raspberry Pi or something and you have a spare laptop and that Pi, I want you to be able to put this stuff on there. And it comes with Syft and Grype, and, and like it has all the stuff that they like need, but it's built specifically for this community of folks like us who are, we're here to ship software. We're here to use all of and consume all those tools. So it needs to be high quality. And with the Bootc pattern and the cloud native pattern, the idea is I think we can maintain our own fix me script. It just happens to end up looking like this. And it's a great place for people to express themselves. So each wallpaper is a scene from somewhere in Earth's past, and they all have an analogy to something in software, which I'm not going to talk about. I just we don't tell people what it is. We let them experience them for themselves. So there's almost always predator and prey. There's almost a little story there that you could put together, that you could do that. And it's kind of meant to highlight that, like, when you go into work and you're connecting all these tools together, because our job could be frustrating, because our job is to take tools written by a bunch of different folks from around the world, wrap it all together and call it a product, whether that's your platform at work or the stuff that you build. Like, you use libraries that are open source to make your products, right? So, like, everybody has to think about this all the time. And I think that the difference is the dinosaurs kind of remind us of the biological part, because we always forget about us, the person, and the burnout and the health of the project. Well, what about health of the contributor? We have to look at it holistically, like ecologists, and not as software people. And what I'm
And
trying to
also
say.
you've got to I like the way you think about this. You've got to think about the next generation because like you and
Yeah,
me, George, like we're going gray, and that's a
we're
sign
done.
of something, right? Yeah, we're done. We need something for the next generation, and I feel like you've tapped into something here because I feel like the oldest man on your Discord server. Like I really feel like
Yeah,
grandpa when I'm talking in there because everyone else in there is just so young and vibrant, and I really
yeah,
applaud you for that. I think that you've done a really good job of like um, tapping into what could be the next generation of contributors to CNCF projects.
yeah. I mean,
Or
we've done that already. So like we've
right,
got
wow,
people, chain guards hired folks out of our organization. People are getting jobs. So like you love to see that, and it's interesting because it's also very frustrating at times because at work we're all about scope, well defined. There's a process. Whereas if you're just getting into this stuff and you're getting into Linux and Excite, you have no idea what limits are. So they go off on these tangents, and sometimes you have to sit there and just let them do it. It's like, oh well, I guess that feature is going to be never shipped, but we got 5 people. There's 2 new people that weren't engaged before trying this crazy thing. Let's see what
yeah, that
happens.
can only be a good thing. Like even
Yeah,
if like this is why I always when some people say I started on Ubuntu and now I'm running Arch, I'm like brilliant. You've like
yeah,
I'm not annoyed that you left Ubuntu and you're now using Arch by any means. You're not using Windows and you're not using a Mac. You've embraced desktop Linux, whatever it might be, whether it is, Bazzite or Arch or whatever. I think it's good to have these stepping stones, these on ramps for people to get into these projects because there's so much open source software out there and all these different languages, all these different ecosystems. There's so
yeah,
much work to do, and we need more of these. And I think I fully applaud what you're doing here because it's really
yeah.
good.
Because we're trying to get them out. It's like I consider us the starter dungeon. Come learn how your computer works. It's pretty great. You're gonna find something else that's
Hmm.
really gonna get you going. It's
Yeah.
not gonna be this thing.
Wonderful. So we're coming up to the time limit for
Okay.
human beings to be able to retain any more information. So uh, is there any like call for help, or is there anything you really need, like that you would really love people to come along and join in and get stuck in?
That CVE action you got going on. I definitely need that. Yeah. So I'm working on our help wanted, tagging the issues. Like I try to copy all the good practices we get from work, but we keep the project simple in Bash and a little bit of Python on purpose. It's intended to be, assist. Sometimes people come and they rotate in for a few cycles and they rotate out. So very much is supposed to be like a chill ops. We try to have like a chill ops mentality, even though we're in the middle of a release. So I'm kind of flipping out today, but it is what it is. But yeah, we're always happy to just hang out.
Nice, sweet. Thanks, George. I really appreciate you taking the time to
Yeah.
explain all of this, and I'm glad I could teach you a tiny little thing while you're here as well. No doubt, a PR
Hey,
will
your
be
thing gives me
landing
peace of
soon.
mind, dude. That thing, that check comes green. I'm good. Like I don't need to, that's the kind of relationship I want with my tools, which is kind of antithetical to what we're.
Right,
Yeah.
wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing this go from strength to strength. Cheers, George.
Cheers.